Whenever I tell this story to people, their responses fall into one of two camps. Most agree with me, that the whole thing sounds terrifying, and that we were right to run away and swear never to go back. The other half laugh, mocking me and Mickey, telling us it's the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. How the hell could we let something like that scare us so much? Thing is, I only believe the first group. The second, the laughers, are faking it. I think they like to sound tough. I think they'd hate to admit that something so simple, so babyish and gentle as a nursery rhyme could scare them. But I also think they're lying. I think if they'd been there, they'd seen what Mickey saw, or what I had seen, then they'd have been just as scared as us. For us, camping was kind of an alternative to going out in the village. In a small town like ours where there are about 3 pubs and everyone knows everyone, going out to the same drinking spots week in and week out can get real old, real fast. Especially when the people drinking in those places are real old already. Going camping was a way to escape, to have some fun or drink with friends of your own age, somewhere away from disapproving glances or complaints from the old folks that you were being too noisy or too boisterous. Nobody's going to come to you at midnight in the middle of the woods and tell you to keep it down, because there's nobody around to care, or at least, you hope there isn't. That night, last summer, we hadn't expected to meet anyone. In fact, we'd set off really early in the day with the express purpose of going so far out into the woods that nobody from town would have followed us. We'd done it before, and it had been a great laugh, so we bought all our goodies, packed them into our rucksacks and set off. By the time the sun went down, we'd already been set up for hours. We played music through our phones, built a big fire and ate sausages that we had badly cooked on the campfire, and which we were lucky didn't give us food poisoning. There were 4 of us there that night. Us 2 boys and 2 girls, in 2 separate tents. The idea was that us lads would sleep in one tent, and the girls in another, though I'm pretty sure my mate Mickey had some ideas of changing that arrangement, if you know what I mean. Around midnight, it became obvious that the fire was dying down, and that we would need to restock the firewood if we wanted to keep it going. A little drunk, and in a giggly mood, we teased that the girls should go off to get it, whilst we brave men stayed at camp to guard the fire. Eventually, though, we agreed we'd all go, thinking that it would be a bit spooky and probably quite fun. Setting off around 10 minutes later, we walked in pairs. Me and Claire huddled closely at the back, and Mickey and Eliane up front, where he already had his arm draped over her shoulder, keeping her warm and protecting her. We were lighting our way with torches, and every few hundred yards, snapped a branch in half, so we would have a marker to find our way back to where we'd set up our camp. Why we didn't just pick up some wood from closer to camp, I don't know. I think Mickey kinda liked the idea of a midnight adventure in the woods with us as the brave protectors. He also said something that sounded vaguely knowledgeable about us having to find already fallen and dry wood, because green leaves would make too much smoke and stuff broken from living trees would be too wet to really get the fire going again. So, we proceeded through the forest together, batting errant branches away from our faces and trying to avoid the few patches where the ground was still moist and a bit muddy underfoot. I spent the majority of the time trying to pick out large roots and fallen branches that might be blocking our path with the torchlight, until around 5 minutes into the walk, when Claire, who had been trailing slightly behind, gently slipped her hand into mine. I remember looking back and catching her eye at that moment as she shyly looked away, and was busy wondering whether she had done it just because she wanted to adjust her balance, or because it meant something more, when Mickey suddenly came to an abrupt stop. "What the?" he called back as he waved his hand in a motion that we all supposed was meant to indicate that we should be quiet. Turning back towards us, he looked more than a little worried. "There's lights, up ahead. Must be someone else camping out here or something," he said. "Wouldn't we have passed them? Or at least heard them?" I whispered in response. Mickey shrugged, and suggested that it might be best for us to change course and go around wherever these folks were camping so as to avoid them. We all nodded in agreement and veered left, the idea being that we could circle far enough around that we would never actually meet the other campers. Problem was, we did not veer far enough for their camp to be invisible to us, and about 5 minutes later, Mickey again stopped. Only this time, instead of stopping, he began marching back in the opposite direction. "Nope, no, not going there, back to camp," he said as he brushed noisily past Elaine and toward where I was standing. "What?" I remember saying, "What is it? What?" Looking through the trees and trying to see beyond them, I could make out only the yellow glow of lights. Oddly, the color of the light seemed slightly off. It wasn't a torchlight, that was clear, but neither did it give off the amber glow, nor the sweet, acrid smell of a large fire. It looked more like candlelight. "What's going on? Why are we turning around?" I called after him. "We just are okay. We just are," he said, pushing past me and marching off in the opposite direction. "Mickey!" I called after him. By this time, Claire, obviously made nervous by Mickey's behavior, had taken back her hand and was now looking nervously about her. "What about the firewood?" I called after him. But it was too late. He had made up his mind and had disappeared out of sight, leaving me and the two girls to trail in his wake. Finding our way back, guided by the branches we had snapped along the way, was not as easy as I had anticipated, but we did manage it without too much trouble. When we got back to camp, we found Mickey already there, packing up his rucksack and pulling up the guy ropes of one of the tents. "Mickey, mate, what are you doing? We're supposed to be sleeping there, you know?" I said, trying to laugh his behavior off, but he was having none of it. Turning around, he pointed to the other tent. "Get that one packed up too. We're leaving." I stared at him in disbelief as the girls began to protest. "Leaving? Mate, it's pitch black. We can't just go wandering about in the woods with all our stuff on." "We'll be fine," he shot back curtly. "We need to go, and we need to go now." "Go? What's gotten into you?" I began to argue when Mickey came rushing over until his nose was a few inches from mine. There was a look in his eyes I had never seen before and never have since. It was terror. "Open up the tent," he said flatly. "Open up the tent and have a look." Shaking my head and trying to make some sense of what the hell was going on, I unzipped the tent that he and I, or Claire and I, were intending to share, and made as if to put my head in. It was at that moment that I noticed. Whereas earlier I had laid my sleeping bag out flat, now it was no longer flat. In fact, it was occupied. Inside the bag, zipped up and positioned as if fast asleep, was a full-size mannequin, the sort of thing you would see sporting clothes in a department store. The one in my bag was entirely black, with no facial features, whilst the one in the other sleeping bag was a sort of orange colour, with a big toothy smile fixed on its face. "Who?" I began. "What?" I struggled to get the words out, to make sense of what I was seeing. As I came back out, Mickey opened the flap of the other tent and showed that the girls' sleeping bags had been similarly filled with mannequins. Lifeless plastic forms resting where we were planning to sleep. Why anyone would have dragged 4 full-sized mannequins the miles up to this spot was beyond me, let alone how. It was difficult enough getting our bags and tents up there, let alone carrying something so heavy and awkwardly shaped. Suddenly, I was entirely in favor of Mickey's plan, with the only difference being that I couldn't give a rat's backside about the tents or the sleeping bags. "Leave them," I said. "We'll come back for them tomorrow when it's light. For now we need to go." And so, we did, though we never did go back for the tents. By the time we made it back to town, cold, scared and tired, the sun was beginning to come up. We dropped the girls home and I went back to Mickey's for a hot drink. Once he'd settled himself at the table, I asked him what I hadn't wanted to mention in front of the girls. At least not whilst we were still in the woods. I asked him what he had seen through the clearing. For a while he didn't answer. Then eventually, still looking away and unable to look me in the eye, he said, "Do you remember that old nursery rhyme? If you go down in the woods today, you'll never believe your eyes. If you go down in the woods today, you'd better go in disguise." "Yeah," I said, wondering where he was going with this. "Today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic, right?" "Yeah, I always thought that tune sounded a bit sinister," he said, before adding almost in a whisper, "That's it. That's what I saw." For a long while after, Mickey wouldn't elaborate any further. He'd say he didn't want to talk about it, or that it didn't matter. Only around a year later, whilst blind drunk, did he actually open up about it. Slurring his words and only half making sense, he said, "Imagine it's midnight, you're in the woods and it's pitch black dark. You come out to a little clearing in the middle, lit up by all these candles, dozens of them, and in the middle there's all these colourful little chairs, like something you'd see in a nursery or playgroup for toddlers. Only instead of toddlers sitting on each of the chairs, it's teddy bears. A different teddy bear in each one. Some of them are massive like the ones you'd win on the fair, and other ones are small, but they're all old, all mangy and covered in mud and mould like they've pulled out of a bin or," he hesitated, "or off a grave, or the side of the road or something. They're all sitting there, in a circle, each with a paper plate in front of them, in the middle of the woods, and on every plate there's something red and wet. Now imagine, you just stumble across this, in the middle of the woods. There's no one around, just these bears, all with their glassy button eyes and their fixed smiles, all just sitting there at their picnic. Then imagine, just for a second, what you'd do if one of them turned around. People have since told me that the whole thing was probably a practical joke, that Mickey probably dragged the mannequins up there days earlier, and despite it being physically impossible, that he'd somehow stuffed them in the sleeping bags in the few minutes we were separated. After all, we only have his word for the strange scene with the stuffed toys. I never saw the so-called teddy bear's picnic. That much, I suppose, is true. But I did see my friend's eyes that night. And because of that, even though what he told me sounds unbelievable, I believe every word.